Welcome to Polaris Live. This is Sarwar Kashmeri inviting our viewers from around the world to the series of programs on United States and China. This program is brought to you live in conjunction with the Foreign Policy Association of New York. Polaris Live is in its third year of operation, and I want to thank our global viewership for your support, your confidence, and our unbiased coverage of the most consequential relationship of our time and its impact on the world. Please feel free, since this program is live, to send us a question through the chat function on your screen. We'll try our best to find time for it. The United States and China are the two largest economies in the world. They're also armed with the largest and strongest militaries in the world. With growing tensions, the two nuclear-armed powers seem to be on hair-trigger alert. Britain's Second World War Prime Minister Winston Churchill's advice that it's always better to jaw than to war seems to be long forgotten. How did things ever get to this stage? Today, I'm fortunate to have as my guest someone who might help us understand this unfortunate state of affairs, Ambassador Charles Freeman. Ambassador Freeman is a visiting scholar at Brown University's Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs, author of 5 books, numerous articles on statecraft, editor of Encyclopedia Britannica article on diplomacy. He's a former U.S. Assistant Secretary of Defense, Ambassador to Saudi Arabia, Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs, Acting U.S. Commissioner for Refugee Affairs, and Director of Program Coordination and Development at the U.S. Information Agency. Intriguingly, and I say intriguingly, he was the principal American interpreter during the late President Nixon's path-breaking visit to China in 1972. Please join me in welcoming to Polaris Live from Washington, D.C., Ambassador Charles Freeman.
Glad to be here, Sarwar.
Thank you for taking the time to join us, Ambassador Freeman. I want to start off by asking you were literally present at the creation of the modern U.S.-China relationship by being a part of the historic team that traveled with President Nixon to Beijing to connect China with the United States and the world, a development that changed the world, I might say. So I'll put the question to you, considering the face-to-face, eyeball-to-eyeball position of the two countries, how did the U.S. and China relations come to this?
Well, I think people forget that from 1950, when the Korean War broke out, and following the 1949 Communist Revolution in China, until 1971, the United States and China had no dialogue whatsoever. It was except a series of very rigidly controlled meetings in Warsaw, Poland, between ambassadors of the two countries. It wasn't until 1971 that Henry Kissinger's secret visit to Beijing indicated a willingness on the part of the United States to address the main question between us and the Chinese, which was the continuing Chinese Civil War and American support for the losing side in that war, Chiang Kai-shek's Republic of China, which had retreated to the island of Taiwan, the province of Taiwan. Kissinger did address that. That enabled the meeting at the heads of state and government level between President Nixon, Mao Zedong, and Zhou Enlai in February 1972. In many ways, we're going back to the previous era of non-communication, where each side has a rigid position which it will not yield. There's a Chinese expression which says that 3 feet of ice did not freeze in a single day. And unfortunately, for the last several decades, we have been steadily freezing this relationship. Why? Well, part of it's psychological. In 1870 or so, the United States became the world's largest economy. And in the 20th century, we became the most powerful country on the planet. And we no longer have that status in an undisputed way. China has now got an industrial economy that is twice the size of ours. It produces over a third of the world's goods. We produce about 1/6. Of course, we have more tax accountants and lawyers and insurance salesmen and bureaucrats than the Chinese. But in what really counts, they have outclassed us. And this is psychologically very difficult for us to accept. So that's one thing. Second, as the Chinese rose in wealth and power, they did so in ways that were offensive to some sections of the American public. For example, their companies made free with intellectual property that belonged to American companies. Of course, this is not unprecedented. We did the same in the 19th century until 1898, when we suddenly got religion on the subject. The Japanese did it in the 20th century, and China did it in the end of the 20th century, in the early part of this one. It's self-correcting, of course, because as China becomes innovative itself, it acquires an interest in protecting rather than stealing or allowing others to steal intellectual property. And finally, I think we have been accustomed since World War II, when we defeated the Japanese Empire and created a strategic vacuum in Asia, which we filled, to being the only great power occupying that space. And China's return to wealth and power now pushes against that American primacy. Again, this is partly psychological, partly a military dimension. So I think that there are many factors. I could go on, but I won't.
The factors you've mentioned, how important do you think is this one facet that you've highlighted, which is, are we really ready to accept another power that is eyeball to eyeball with us? Have we gotten so used to being the only game in town that it really, from a DNA, we cannot accept it? How important do you think that is?
I think it's very important. We are at the moment in a state of distress domestically. Very few people in the United States retain the optimism for which we were always famous. There's a great deal of difficulty. We have created a plutocracy. Social mobility is way down, way below that of European countries now. Income is, as I suggested, maldistributed. Our infrastructure is collapsing. Our educational system is declining in its efficiency. And we are less innovative, although we still remain quite innovative. So we have grave doubts about ourselves. And in this context, we see what Fareed Zakaria correctly called the rise of the rest, meaning countries like China, India, or a reassertive Russia, not to mention Japan, a great power that is a rival of ours in the economic sphere, and even parts of the Arab world
right.
coming up. And this is very disturbing. And it seems that our principal objective in foreign policy is to maintain our primacy. And we don't really know how to do this, because during the Cold War, we led a block of nations we somewhat facetiously called the free world. Much of it wasn't very free, but it was free in the sense that it was not part of the Soviet bloc. And we were primus inter pares. Others followed us in an almost feudal fashion. And this is all disappearing now as a multipolar order.
Yes.
So this is extremely disturbing, and we have not apparently come to grips with what we need to do to deal with it.
It's so it is distressing, as you point out. I know you were deeply connected with the U.S. Information Agency, and when I left India many years ago to come to America, a big reason that I did so was the U.S. Information Service office in Bombay was so close to my college, and I used to go there. They used to coach me when it came to choose university. They helped me select one, apply for it. All of that is gone, isn't it, Ambassador Freeman?
When the Soviet Union defaulted on the Cold War and its contest with us for global hegemony, which is what happened. We did not defeat it on the battlefield or otherwise. It gave up. When that happened, there was a theory, a triumphalist theory in the United States, that we no longer needed to explain ourselves through government media because our television media, cable TV and the like would do this for us. So the theory was CNN, Fox News, whatever would tell America's story abroad as the U.S. Information Service had. And therefore, we euthanized the U.S. Information Agency and we got rid of it. That was a grave error because one of the effects of an open media environment operated by American oligopolies like CNN and Fox News is that the ugly side of America is now constantly stressed abroad.
Yes.
And foreign views of America have deteriorated very greatly. Whether that's justified or not, I don't know. But clearly, all of the problems we exhibit, whether they're racism, gun violence, disrespect for the rule of law, or other facets of our society, are all on ugly view abroad.
Yes, and that's as I pointed out earlier, rather vexing to people like you, who played such an important part in this. One of the things that I think about often is that it's hard to find anyone of any political persuasion in Washington that has anything good to say about China. And to my understanding, exactly the same situation exists in Beijing. Do you think it will be easy to walk back this consensus of public opinion in both countries? I mean, once we cross that bridge of starting to emotionally hate, if I may use the word, which I know is too strong, hate one another, how can we walk this back?
It's going to be very difficult. I fear we will have to go through some terrible disaster, be hit on the head with a 2x4, if you will, to recognize that much of our view of China these days is, in fact, delusional, verging on the psychotic. There's a difference between neurosis and psychosis, which has been explained this way, that neurotics know that, psychotics insist that 2 + 2 is 5 and are prepared to kill you to make that point. Whereas neurotics know that 2 + 2 is 4, but are very unhappy about it. We've past the moment of neurosis. We attribute virtually every ill in our society to the Chinese. But it was not they who developed the tax system and the labor management system and the financial capitalism that led to the export of American jobs. It was convenient to export them to China. But as we're now seeing, if you don't see China as an appropriate destination for American jobs, then Vietnam, Bangladesh, Ethiopia, or whatever will do just as well. So our problems are domestically made. They're made in America, but China's become a scapegoat. And piled onto this is the legacy of the security state that we created during the Cold War, a military-industrial complex which depends on having an enemy. When the Cold War ended, we suffered from enemy deprivation syndrome, which is the sick feeling you have when you don't have a clear enemy. And China was put in that place. And China is a convenient enemy because it's very high tech. When we thought that bearded men in caves in Waziristan, men with lice in their beards, were our enemies, there was no justification for high tech weaponry since it was irrelevant. But China is actually out innovating us in some respects in the military sphere. And that makes it a very convenient country to demonize, as we customarily do in our democracy with anyone who opposes us.
I want to pick up on this point for just a few more minutes, but allow me to take a moment to remind our viewers that PolarisLive.com is a reader-supported channel. To receive news about upcoming programs and to support our work, please visit my website, kashmeri.com, KASHMERI.com. And now back to my guest, Ambassador Freeman. Defense Secretary Gates used to say, Ambassador Freeman, when he was testifying to Congress, he said that how is it possible that we can in the United States have more military bands than we have foreign service officers? Do you think there's something to that? I mean, a lot of the points that you've mentioned impact directly on the state of our diplomatic muscle. And I wonder if you can just talk a little bit about that. You've had a long, distinguished career and a big perspective.
During the Cold War, we came to equate national security with the military alone. That was not how the Cold War began. George Kennan's concept of containment, which was a grand strategy, was primarily diplomatic. And he himself was quite distressed as over the years it evolved to become almost purely military. As I said, we interpreted the Soviet default on the Cold War as a military victory, which it was not. So we tend to analyze the world in military terms. And we have, as General Eisenhower, President Eisenhower warned, developed a military-industrial congressional complex, with the result that our defense budget does not begin with matching resources to a threat analysis, but is basically treated by Congress as a jobs program. We have what some have called military Keynesianism. We use the defense budget to fund research and development in all areas. The defense budget is, by the way, only a small a portion of what we spend on national security. It's about 60%. We're spending almost $1.5 trillion on national security, which makes us by far the most spendthrift country internationally. It's not clear to me that spending money equates to strength. Certainly, North Vietnam showed that it might not,
Sure.
And Afghan Taliban sadly showed that for all the defense spending we had and the defense effort we made, military effort, defense is a euphemism, of course, we were not able to prevail. So we have a situation where our foreign policy is essentially military in nature, militaristic, focused on the military. And we've forgotten the importance of preventing situations from developing to the point where you have to use the military. Diplomacy is about convincing other parties to see the world in the manner that you do and to accept that their interests coincide with yours and that they should therefore follow your suggestions for their policy. We try to convince them not to allow confrontations to develop to the point where the use of force becomes necessary. We have repeatedly failed in this regard. Ukraine is a classic example of this, and I fear we may be headed in the same direction with the Taiwan issue.
It's but let me. I'm glad you brought that up. I want to just dwell a bit on the Ukraine the situation. So the Indian foreign minister was asked not long ago why India is on the fence when it comes to supporting US-led Western sanctions on Russia. And he said India is not standing on the fence, we are standing our ground. And this seems to be the opinion of some 80% of the world's population, which does not, as I understand it, support the American-led sanctions. China, of course, but South Africa, Brazil, India, and is there a message here for the relevance of U.S. diplomacy?
Certainly there is. If you don't listen to others, they feel little empathy for your position to begin with. You're talking about our Minister Jaishankar, who's I think a very wise foreign minister, is talking about what is now called the Global South. I think a better term for it is the one that Sergei Karaganov, the Russian strategic thinker, has applied, and that is, he calls it the global majority. The global majority is no longer content to be directed or bullied, if you will, by superpowers, Russia, the United States, China, or India for that matter. And countries are in around the world are asserting their own independence, their own strategic autonomy, which is the position that India has traditionally taken, and they see no merit in joining the United States in an anti-Russian crusade. And in fact, in the case of countries like India or China or Brazil, for that matter, they regard the reemergence of Russia as a world power, a great influence on the world, as important to sustaining multipolarity. Without Russia, if Russia were destroyed, as some in Washington wish it were broken up like the Soviet Union, it would not be there to buttress a multipolar order, and we might come down to another bipolar world order of the sort that we had during the Cold War, this one perhaps between China and the United States. Nobody wants that. So countries are exercising their own judgment, taking their own positions, and we have not developed, in the absence of any real emphasis on diplomacy, we have not developed a method to persuade them of our rectitude and the correctness of our positions.
Well, following on that train of thought, there was a time when America was known for its principles. One of them is human rights, being fair to everyone, and following principled policies consistently. I'm tangenting now, but it's a related discussion to Prime Minister Modi's upcoming visit to India. And it seems as though we've forgotten that India also, like any country, acts in its own interest. Do you think we're getting a little carried away by simply removing the human rights issues in India, which are growing by the day, off the table, and simply focusing on manufacturing jet engines and becoming another armed ally, if you will, of the United States? Do you think diplomatically that we need to be very careful that we don't hit quicksand?
Well, first of all, I think it's preposterous to imagine that India is going to become an ally of the United States in the sense of becoming a follower of the United States on global issues. It will continue to assert its own position based on its own interests. I would say there are three issues here that we are failing to deal with. One is apparently universal. Aristotle predicted that democracy would degenerate into demagoguery and the rule of the mob, or the tyranny of the majority over the minority. And we're seeing this in every democracy, unfortunately, including our own, a trend toward autocracy, elected autocracy. That is what is happening in India. It is what has happened in Israel. It is arguably happened in the UK, and we're living in the United States in a moment when this is clearly a menace to constitutional democracy. So that's one thing. The second thing is that the Biden administration's theory that the world order is being driven by a grand contest between democracy and autocracy is clearly incorrect. If it were, we would have sympathy for our position on Ukraine, perhaps. And we would not be experiencing the degeneration, the decadence of democracy that we are. And finally, the Biden administration asserts that the world is being driven by great power rivalry. But in fact, if you look at areas like the Middle East, you see that they have broken free of this. And the rivalries are now regional, local, and they really don't give a fig of what external great powers want them to do. They do what they see as in their own interest, and that's that. The power of diplomacy, I should say, was illustrated in the Middle East by the Chinese mediation following that of Iraq and Oman, of relations between Saudi Arabia and Iran. China knows something important, and that is that you should have cordial, cooperative relations with as many countries as possible. And you should not sever communication, if at all possible. We follow a different drummer on that.
Yes. Well, I want to try, we're running close to the half hour, but I want to try and close on an optimistic note. And I wonder if you could, in the time we have remaining, my mother used to say you can't clap with only one hand, but I wonder if you would be comfortable recommending a couple of policy changes, both to China and the United States, to restart this process of repairing the relationship.
Yes, I think the principal thing that is required, and the Chinese continually say this to their credit, is mutual respect. Bismarck famously said that you should be polite even when you're declaring war. and I think we need to be respectful of the Chinese. They have a system that we don't like. Apparently, the Chinese people, according to all the polling data we have, are very fond of their system. Some 85% think China's moving in the right direction. The comparable figure in the United States is about 1/4. That is 25%. So we assume that you can separate the Chinese Communist Party and its 94 million members from the Chinese populace, but that is not correct. And when we refer to China, not as the People's Republic of China, but as the Chinese Communist Party, we are insulting that state. I think the Chinese, too, have a tendency, which they seem to be correcting in the form of eliminating some of the wolf warrior diplomacy that they became famous for. Just as we got rid of Pompeo, they got rid of Zhao Lijian and some others who are famous for this. And I think they understand and would respond to a polite, respectful request to listen to what they have to say, because the beginning of influence is listening, and we've forgotten how to do that.
Well, we could go on for a long time. You really are an example of how, when we forget history, we lose so much in crafting our diplomacy. And you've not only had a distinguished career, but it's obvious from this conversation that you respect history, you remember it, and I do hope your advice is listened to much more than a lot of other people who seem to have prime ground in Washington. So I just want to say again, Mr. Ambassador, I thank you for taking some of your valuable time to be with Polaris Live, and I do hope we can call on you again to come visit us.
Thank you, Sarwar. I appreciate very much those kind remarks, and it was a pleasure to join you.
Thank you again. I would like to remind our viewers around the world, you've been listening to a conversation with Ambassador Chas Freeman from Washington. Please continue to tune in and support us. Until the next Polaris Live, goodbye.